For the very few of you who may know, who might not know, my name is Reverend Rondecia Jarrett Shell. I am the other Jarrett Shell, Peter Jarrett Shell's wife. There's very few pastors married to yet another pastor, but here we are. And it's my honor to be here with you this morning. I haven't been in Calvary in such a long time, definitely since before the pandemic. And so when Peter asked if I would help out, I said absolutely. I also told him that I might share an embarrassing story about him, but I couldn't think of any. He is a very good man, and I've learned so much from him. As you may know, I was the interim rector over at St. Stephen's in the Incarnation. I finished up my 2-year interim period. They're in the process of hiring their next rector. And I'm there for 1 more week, but mentally I'm on vacation. But during that time, I helped lead a Spanish congregation, and Peter's bilingual, and I am not. And so when they hired me, I said, but I don't speak Spanish. But they were okay with that because there were other things that they needed help in, and they knew that I could do that. And Peter was very helpful and helped me understand traditions and culture expectations of a Spanish congregation because he worked in Spanish ministry before. What to expect, what to be look out for, how to greet, all those things he was able to help me with, and of course every now and then help me with special services, which had cultural context that I had not been a part of. And so his wisdom, as well as 2 other clergy in the diocese, helped me put this community back together to be able to find their new priest. And so in that, I say thanks for him, but also this understanding of the different rules and expectations in the spaces in which we find ourselves in, right? The different contexts and expectations. For instance, and probably in this context too, but not in every context, if I go into a Latino woman's home and she offers me something to eat, I'm going to eat it. It would be rude for me to say no. And because they want to care for the person who comes in, bring in the stranger, care for the stranger. And so they will offer, is there anything you need? Water, food, all that. Next thing I know, there's a full plate of food. I know to go hungry. But those are the particular things that we do. I don't necessarily do that at my home. When someone comes over, I may offer them a glass of water. Would you like something to drink or anything like that? But a whole meal, unless I invited you over for dinner, I don't have that expectation in plans. There's nothing wrong with those 2 things, but understanding the different rules and contexts in which the spaces that we live in, right, is one of the things that I'm trying to teach Joshua about as well. The different rules and contexts of our home as opposed to someone else's home. What their rules and expectations are different from what he experiences at our home. Right? As he always says, well, so-and-so's mom lets them do that. Right? Y'all parents remember that? And you say, they're not my child. I'm not their mom. That's not my house. You're my child, my house, my rules. Right? All those things that he is learning and negotiating at age 10, now it's starting to be like, wait a minute, hold up. It doesn't seem to make sense. This summer, we're doing Big Kid Camp, which is basically me teaching him how to do his laundry, clean his room, make sure the bathroom's clean, make his lunch, clean up after making his lunch, like all those things now that I'm pretty sure I did before I was 10. So I'm being lenient about waiting so long. But him learning these things, and of course he would say, well, so-and-so don't do that at their home. Right? And I say, but you're in our home. And you must understand that what we do here is for us, and if you go over there and someone makes you a sandwich, or have these other rules, you follow their rules. That's their home. And him trying to wrap his mind around those things. The different ways and contexts and expectations that we have in the world that we negotiate. We may not even notice we're negotiating that, What we're doing at work is different what we do at home. What we do at our grandkids' house is different what we do at our own house. And how we have to understand how those things work. And sometimes it fits just fine, and sometimes it doesn't, right? When I was a teenager, I was at my grandmother's house. I think it was like we go there anytime, right? It doesn't have to be Thanksgiving, Christmas, or whatever. We go, hang out with grandma, hang out with my cousins. They live in North Carolina. I love being at her house. I love listening to her stories. She is a firecracker, and she has really great jokes. And so one of those special visits, I was listening to my grandmother, and I saw this. They had this wonderful picture of her standing in front of a townhouse in New York. And she was in this wonderful outfit. She looked fabulous, right? And she had to be in her 20s. I don't know how old she was. Black don't crack. She could have been much younger than that. She could have been, whatever. She looked amazing. And I pointed to that picture and I said, Grandma, you didn't always know Jesus. And she laughed, because she normally wouldn't laugh at me at that. But then she told me what it was like living in Harlem and how she traveled there at age 13 by herself to live with family members. This whole wonderful story of this traveling, this adventure that she had, and how important it was for her. And I didn't know that she lived in New York at age 13. And so as she's telling me the story, my mother comes into the living room where we're sitting and talking, and she goes, Rondecia, I need you to go into the kitchen and wash the dishes. And then my grandmother turns to my mother and says, no, you go wash the dishes. Now we're crossing rules. And my mother reinserts her rule and says, but she is my daughter. And my grandmother's response to her was like, yes, and you are my daughter. And my mother says, okay. And then she goes and does that. And then I continue listening to my grandmother's stories. I'm very appreciative of my mother giving me that space. And I say it that way because my mother could have inserted, but like, come on. She has responsibilities that she needs to learn and understand, all that other stuff. But I think my mother understood what was happening in that moment. How many times will I get a chance to hear these stories, right? How many more years will I have of that? And so for that rule and expectation was bent and understood. There's a moment of love and there's a moment of learning that is happening. There's an honoring of elders that is happening. And my grandmother was enjoying that time, and I was enjoying that time. And I'm in my 40s, and I remember it as an important time. Now, I can share that stories to my child, and he can understand those bendings and understandings of the rules. In our gospel reading, we have a little bit of that. The disciples have been eating without washing their hands. Now, I don't know what the situation is, but I stopped right there. I was like, Jesus, I'm kind of feeling like the Pharisees. In this age of Purell, I think they need to wash their hands. Right? But I don't know what's exactly going on for what the disciples are experiencing, but I think that's important to know, that they have been traveling and walking and meeting people and doing all these things. Maybe they don't have access to that which they need, but also maybe they're just hungry. I mean, before the story, we have the feeding of the 5,000, and in that story, we don't eat, and everybody stopped and washed their hands as we were breaking bread and finding the fish, right? Like, those folks were hungry in the middle of a field, hearing Jesus talk for hours. When you're hungry, right? And so those rules and expectations there needs to be a understanding of the context of what is happening in that moment, right? When I was in college, I went to this etiquette workshop, dinner etiquette workshop. It was like a 5-course meal sort of a thing. And me and my friends signed up because we were college students. We didn't have a lot of money for food. We were like, 5-course meal? Of course. What are you serving? Absolutely. I'll sign up. So we signed up for this, and we're going through, they had all the forks and all the spoons, which glass was for this, and going through the whole thing. And my friend leans over, and he's Korean, and he leans over and says, these rules are for those who are not hungry. Right? And I thought about it, it was true. Those aren't the rules for when you're hungry. You just need one fork. You just need one spoon. You don't need a whole bunch of them. The plate is smaller. The meal is small because the focus is not on the quantity, but on the taste and experience of the flavors. So you just need that's why a smaller portion. But then we went and talked about what it's like in our home to eat, right? What is it? And for him, he says, the younger folks do not touch the food. The food is there until the elders have made their plate. And once the elders have made their plate, then everyone can eat, right? We talked about how, like, some cultures use their hands and what that's like, the significance of chopsticks, and what that means for folks, where folks sit, but the whole goal of it is for everyone to be able to eat, right? How all these rules are different depending on one's context, and when you're in that context, how do you respect it and understand it, right? How it's portioned out. The baby sitting with the mama to eat, right? All those sort of things. So when I look at the Pharisees, when they're talking about this thing, I don't think they're understanding the context and why the disciples were hungry, right? And what they had access to. But Jesus doesn't go into the whole thing about context. He goes to another thing. Use the words of the elders. Let me tell you about the elders. Let me tell you how you're treating. You're saying these rules, but you don't respect elders. You don't respect them. And it goes on to say how this rule, this thing of, you must pay the church first. If you can't take care of your elders, or you got to take care of the church, take care of the church, right? Because you're giving that to God, and that's more important. And Jesus is like, but we have a commandment that says honor our mother and father, to take care of our family. And so if you do that, if you have to decide whether or not your mother or father is able to eat or to pay a bill or all that, versus, man, God, you're still giving to God by taking care of your family. You're still, there's a context of the reason of that rule, and it's about love. The commandment is about love of our neighbors, of our family, of our community. The 10 Commandments are basically broken down into the love of God and the love of our neighbors. And so when thinking about these rules in context, Jesus is like, think about how love applies in this context, in the gray. Jesus has an issue with hypocrites. I don't want to say he hates hypocrites, but he talks about them a lot in Matthew. I think he has a problem with hypocrites, and I think everybody does. When we see how things don't fit right. So we say education is important in our country, but yet we see that some schools have supplies and other schools don't. When we see that we care about women and children, but then we make sure that they don't have the resources they need to care for women and children. All these things that we hear people say is important, but when we see how their actions are what's happening with their actions is not in alignment. And Jesus says, let's try to be in alignment. Let's understand that yes, we have these rules, but those rules don't fit in every context and for everyone. And we have to reflect on that and think about that and question that and say, how are we living in love? How are we working in love? How are we being a community that cares, that sees the Spirit of God in each and every one of us and lifts that up? Yes, we have the rules, and they might have fit in one context, but they may not fit in this one, or they may not fit now, and it constantly has to be understood of why we make those decisions. When my son asked me, why do we do it here at our home, but they don't do it there at their home, I could have easily said, and sometimes I do, because you're my child. But I told him, I said, there's just 3 of us. And the 3 of us have to care for one another. And for us to do that, this is how we're going to organize the home. So you're going to help with the laundry. And you're going to make your own lunch because mommy and daddy are sometimes tired, but the food is there and you're tall enough to reach it. All these things are like, these are why. Because we care and love for one another. And when mommy and daddy do it, it's because we care and love you. And when you are in a community, you do what you do for care and love of others and sometimes of yourself. That's a more advanced explanation, and it may have to be said several times. But to understand how love is important, there's a lot of gray that we encounter every day about trying to make the right decisions. And that's where we lean on God, where we trust God to help us understand what is best to do. I was driving down the street the other day, and there was a woman with a sign, and it said that she had children, and you've probably seen folks do this too, and they need help. And my son is there sitting with me, and we're looking, and he's saying, well, do we have anything to help? I was like, I don't have anything on me right now. But I'm just gonna pray right now that someone helps her. Like I said, I can't do it now, but I know God can, so I'm just gonna pray to God right now. I'm gonna lift her up in prayer. And we drive, and we drop off our errand, and we come through again, and the woman is still there with the sign, and there's another woman who jumps out of her car, opens up her trunk, and pulls out bags of food. And looks at the woman like, do you want this? And she is just, the lady is just crying and is just happy and just gives her food. And I point to that son, I said, see, won't God do? It says, we prayed in love. This woman here is acting in love. Know what happens in the gray. I don't know what the woman in the car had the food for, whether it was for her family, and she saw this and said, let me help this other family. I don't know what it was, but she saw the gray and said, this is how I can provide. The 10 Commandments, the commandment of God is about love. So I invite you to reflect on love in the times where things are gray, where you're not sure exactly what are the best rules to follow, what would work, how to be in this particular context. Ask yourself about love. And how does the love of God work in that moment and in that space? And let the Holy Spirit lead you and guide you. Amen. Amen.